shellfire coming in every day, fighting on the outskirts of town, and yet there are still, I was told, several thousand people still living in this town, all mostly sort of hanging out in their basements. The partly, as a consequence of the Soviet Union, which was always paranoid about war with the West and nuclear war. Every building just about has a very deep cellar for people to hide in, and we met families who, during the occupation, during their occupation, when they were on the front line on the other side, if you like, had lived in their basements for 6 months or more, sort of hardly ever seeing the light of day except to come up to get food.
You are, remind us where you are and what's happening. Just bring us right up to date.
Well, I'm in Kiev at the moment, so it's not particularly interesting because it's quite calm here today. We haven't had any missile attacks for the last couple of days here. There was a massive volley of missiles on Kiev early in the week before I got here. I've been spending most of the last couple of weeks out on the out in the Far East, on and near the eastern front lines, looking at the sort of situation in the war. Particularly, obviously, we were interested in the tank issue and what difference those tanks that have all now been agreed and on their way to Ukraine will make in the fighting coming up over the course of the year, and also looking at what the situation is for ordinary people living in those areas. Lots of people still living, actually on the front lines, but sort of more to the point, a lot of people are living in areas that have been liberated from the Russians in those two big offensives by the Ukrainians in the autumn in the south and in the east, and looking at how they are trying to rebuild their lives and live. Obviously they've been on the front lines. Their houses are often blown up and destroyed. A lot of destruction, a lot of psychological consequences as well, obviously, for people who lived under Russian occupation and lived with the fighting, and how they're trying to rebuild their lives, even though the fighting's still going on only a few miles away in some cases.
I mean, you talk about the number of people who are living close to the front line. How difficult is life for them? I mean, we've talked about the exceptionally cold temperatures, the damage to the energy infrastructure. I'm just wondering, on a basic level of keeping warm, keeping dry and well fed, how challenging is that basic level of living?
Well, if you're not far from the front lines, it's not bad, actually. The Ukrainians have done a good job, I mean, quite striking job to me, of keeping the basics of life going, even under these extraordinary situations. I mean, if you think the number of times power stations have been hit and destroyed by these Russian missile attacks, yet there is still electricity even in towns quite close to the front line. And in the major cities, which have been targeted as well. The towns near the front line in the east have rolling blackouts, so like they're on a rota where for a couple of times a day there are 3-hour power cuts. But that's actually quite manageable. The more extraordinary thing is people actually who refuse to leave, even when their towns are under bombardment. I was in Bakhmut, which regular listeners will know is partially surrounded and has been under attack for months now. Sort of really heavy bombardment. Lots of the buildings are just destroyed. Shellfire coming in every day, fighting on the outskirts of town, and yet there are still, I was told, several thousand people still living in this town, all mostly sort of hanging out in their basements. Partly, as a consequence of the Soviet Union, which was always paranoid about war with the West and nuclear war. Every building just about has a very deep cellar for people to hide in, and we met families who, during the occupation, during their occupation, when they were on the front line on the other side, if you like, had lived in their basements for 6 months or more, sort of hardly ever seeing the light of day except to come up to get food. And some incredibly brave volunteers we met also, who have been taking food into these frontline areas and braving the shelling to drive trucks of food and water for people who have insisted on staying put to collect.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? Of course, we are moving towards, in the next month, it's going to be a year since this war began. What's your assessment? You spent a lot of time in Ukraine covering the war. What's your assessment of, well, what's happened in the last year and then what's likely to come in the spring?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this because the West is very enthusiastically supporting Ukraine, and there's definitely a sort of cognitive bias, if you like, in our reporting of Ukraine. I mean, they had these two sensational gains in the autumn, as I say, last year. When they took firstly the most of the province of Kharkiv in the northeast, they took back from the half of which was taken by the Russians. They took that back, and then of course they took the city of Kherson in the south. Now, if they can repeat that, then things are looking good for Ukraine, the Ukrainian side. However, it has to be said the Russians are just bringing in so many people, and they are so relentless in their preparedness to take casualties. These mass wave attacks, throwing guys over the top until they take a few hundred yards here and a few hundred yards there. I mean, I don't think the Russians are going to threaten Kharkiv or Kiev again like they did last year. There's been rumors that they would re-invade from the north like they did last year or through Belarus. There's no sign of that, I think. But when they are prepared to take such heavy casualties and have such a preponderance of hardware, it's hard to see any fast gains by the Ukraine, except in these like lightning strikes here and there. And I think that's what Ukraine must be hoping for, is a couple more lightning strikes and the Russians will crumble. But otherwise, I think we're in for a very long haul. There's still a huge amount of territory in Ukraine under Russian control. I think it's about 18%, I read, of Ukrainian territory under Russian control. And that's going to take a long time to dislodge, I think.